Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge had signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country may be done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up about the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, to literally astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterward, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire. Secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, and made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly from his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw to 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggar implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what o'clock it was. No man or woman ever, once in all his life, inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal. He could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day. The candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices, the ruddy smear upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by, and was brewing up on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore, the clerk put on his white comforter, and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that it was his first intimation of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all aglow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be so dismal? What reason have you to be so morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with, "Humbug!" "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on their lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned Uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it?" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." "Let me alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar year, when men and women seem by one constant to open their shut hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they were really fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me some good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible to the impropriety. He poked his fire, extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come dine with us tomorrow." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge.
Fred left the room without an angry word. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on Bob Cratchit, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge. Bob returned the greetings cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said one gentleman, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make a slight provision for the poor. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," said Scrooge. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. "You'll want all day off tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge to his clerk. "If it's quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his coat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. Scrooge lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner, Marley. There was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door. Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Tonight, Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, not a knocker, but Marley's face. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key, turned it sturdily, and walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first. He fastened the door and walked through his rooms to see that all was right. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet. He sat down. He heard a noise coming up the stairs, coming straight toward his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Marley's ghost. A chain was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound around him like a tail, and it was made of cash-boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who began to apply this to himself. "Business," cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were just a drop of water in a comprehensive ocean of my business. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of procuring Ebenezer." Scrooge fell upon his knees and said, "What do you want with me?" "You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread." The apparition walked backwards, and at every step it took, a window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open, and the spectre floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge closed the window and tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Stave 2. the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Was it a dream or not? Light flashed up in the room upon the instant. A figure wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. But the strangest thing about the figure was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light. It held under its arm a great extinguisher for a cap. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge. "No, your past." Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him here. "Your welfare," said the ghost. It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped Scrooge gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." They passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either side. The city had entirely vanished. The darkness and mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. "Good God," said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." Travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them, every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas, what good had it ever done him? "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, to a door at the back of a house. The door opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Young Ebenezer was alone again when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously toward the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fran?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimming with glee. "Home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should. And he sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and are never to come back here. But first we're to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world." "You're quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again, and stood upon tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door. "Always a delicate creature upon whom breath might have withered," said the ghost, "but she has a large heart." "So she has," said Scrooge. "She died a woman," said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost, your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, Yes. Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it? Said Scrooge. I was apprenticed here. They went in. At sight of an old gentleman sitting behind a high desk, Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart. It's Fezziwig, alive again. Scrooge's former self, now grown to a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Lord bless me, yes, there he is. Ah, he was very much attached to me, was poor Dick. Dear, dear Dick. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight, Christmas Eve. Dick, Christmas, Ebenezer. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. There was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was mince pies, and plenty of beer. The spirit signed to Scrooge to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise? It isn't that, said Scrooge, heated by the remark. It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. What is the matter? Asked the ghost. Nothing particular, said Scrooge. Something, I think, the ghost insisted. No, said Scrooge. No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all. My time grows short, observed the spirit. Quick! Again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had not taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a morning dress, in whose eyes there were tears which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve, said the girl. What idol has displaced you? Scrooge rejoined. A golden one. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more, conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me? I told you these were shadows of things that have been, said the ghost. That they are what they are, do not blame me. Remove me, Scrooge exclaimed. I cannot bear it. He turned upon the ghost, and Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright. Dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon the spirit's head. The spirit dropped beneath it. Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, but he could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. Scrooge was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Stave 3, the second of the 3 spirits. Awaking in the middle of a snore, Scrooge lay upon his bed. A blaze of light streamed upon it. He began to think that the source of this ghostly light might be the adjoining room. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the knob, a large voice bade him enter. Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present, said the spirit. Look upon me. Scrooge reverently did so. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told. They went invisibly as they had been before, straight to Camden Town, to the home of Scrooge's clerk, Bob Cratchit. Up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which were cheap, and she laid the cloth assisted by Belinda Cratchit, her second daughter, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and now two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own. What has ever got your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit, and your brother, Tiny Tim. And Martha wasn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour. Here's Martha, mother, said a girl, appearing as she spoke. In came Bob Cratchit, in his threadbare clothes, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulders. Tiny Tim bore a little crutch, and his limbs supported by an iron frame. The two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did Tim behave? Asked Mrs. Cratchit. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and that it might be pleasant to them to remember, upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told his wife this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Tiny Tim's active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back he came before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to the stool by the fireplace. Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon this little stool. Bob held Tiny Tim's withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in this poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. The child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." The Cratchits were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, and pleased with one another. When they faded, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily. As Scrooge and the spirit went along the street, it was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the spirit standing smiling by his side. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "He said that Christmas was a humbug. He believed it, too." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece by marriage. "At least, you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. The consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or in his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him, if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless." The whole scene passed off, and Scrooge and the spirit were again upon their travels. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. He beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. Stave 4. The Last of the Spirits. The phantom was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head and left nothing visible, save one outstretched hand. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. "You are about to show me shadows of things that have not yet happened, but will happen in time before us. Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer Scrooge received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared this silent shape so much his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. Lead on, spirit." They went to an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. There was a shop. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys and nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuge of iron of all kinds. Sitting by a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age. A woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. "Ah," laughed the woman, "this is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead." "Spirit," said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case might be my own. My life tends that way now. Let me see some tenderness connected with a death," said Scrooge. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The two young little Cratchits were still as statues in one corner. Tiny Tim was not there. The mother was engaged in sewing, but surely all were very quiet. The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I won't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed. But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work. "And his father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there's your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to do it most. Then the two young Cratchits got up on his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He broke down all at once. He left the room and went upstairs to the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, said Bob, for he is the pleasant-spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, "I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit," he said, "and heartily sorry for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. Now it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. I'm sure he's a good soul, said Mrs. Cratchit. I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, for this first parting that there was among us. Never, father, they all cried. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried again. I am very happy, said little Bob. I am very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, and the two young Cratchits kissed him. Spirit of Tiny Tim, tiny childish essence, was from God. The phantom moved away. Scrooge followed. The city seemed to spring up about them, and there they were, in the heart of it. This court, said Scrooge, through which they were now hurrying, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in the days to come. The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. The house is yonder, Scrooge exclaimed. Why do you point away? The finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. Scrooge joined it once again and accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Spirit, he cried, tight clutching at his robe, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I have been, but for this intercourse. Why, show me this, if I am past all hope. For the first time the hand appeared to shake. Good spirit, Scrooge pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it, assure me that I yet may change the shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart all year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons they teach. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw the altercation in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down to a bedpost. Stave 5. The end of it. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends of it. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. O Jacob Marley, heaven, and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees. He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. I don't know what to do, cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath. I am as light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. I am so giddy I feel like a drunken man. Whoop! Hello there! Whoop! Merry Christmas to everybody! A Happy New Year to all the world! Hello there! Hello! Yahoo! And he frisked to the sitting room, and was now standing on one leg, perfectly winded. Running to the window, he opened it and put his head out. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, cold, piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells, oh glorious, glorious. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes. Eh? Returned the boy with all his might of wonder. What's today, my fine fellow? Yelled Scrooge. Today? Replied the boy. Why, it's Christmas Day. "It's Christmas Day," Scrooge said to himself. "I haven't missed it." "Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner?" Scrooge inquired. "I should hope I did," replied the lad. "An intelligent boy," said Scrooge. "A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one." "What? The one as big as me?" returned the boy. "What a delightful boy," said Scrooge. "It's a pleasure to talk with him. Yes, my buck, the big one, the one as big as you." "Walker?" exclaimed the boy. "No, no," said Scrooge. "I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them direction to where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you a half-crown. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit," whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. "He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim." The hand with which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poultryman. As he stood there waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. "I shall love it as long as I live," cried Scrooge, patting the knocker with his hand. "I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has on its face. What a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello! Whoop! How are you? Merry Christmas!" It was a turkey indeed. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. "Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town," said Scrooge. "You must have a cab." The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. He dressed himself all in his best, and got out into the streets. He had not gone far, when coming on towards him, he beheld one of the gentlemen who had walked into his counting-house the day before, asking for a donation for the poor. It sent a pang across Scrooge's heart to think about how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met. But he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman by both hands, "how do you do? A Merry Christmas to you, sir." "Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes," said Scrooge, "that's my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your question, and you will have—" Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me," cried the gentleman, as if his breath were gone. "My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?" "My dear sir," cried the gentleman, shaking hands with Scrooge again, "I don't know what to say to such generosity." "Don't say anything, please," retorted Scrooge. "Come and see me, will you? Come and see me." "I will," cried the gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. "Thank ye," said Scrooge. "I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. God bless you." He went to church and walked about and watched the people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head, and looked down into the kitchens of houses, and up to the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl. Nice girl, very. "Yes, sir, he's in the dining-room, sir, along with the missus." "Thank ye. He knows me," said Scrooge. "I'll go in here, my dear." He sidled his face in around the door. "Fred," said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her, or he wouldn't have done it on any account. "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Who's that?" "It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. Wonderful evening, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office the next morning. Bob was a full 18 1/2 minutes behind his time. "Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped Bob on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist you in your struggling family, and we'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon before this very fire over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of all of us, and so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one.